Back when I was just 15 years old, my parents moved us out of the city and to a small town about 30 miles away from where I grew up. I had to start 10th grade at a whole new school with no friends, and it was probably the loneliest and most stressful period of my entire life. I was actually kind of mad at my parents for uprooting my whole existence like that, and a new bedroom and bigger backyard meant nothing to me when I'd lost all my friends and all my familiar hangouts. I guess that makes me sound like a total ingrate, but where we lived wasn't exactly a great place for teenagers, lots of drugs, etc. And so these days, I get it, but back then, I was not happy. I was a complete nervous wreck during the first week of 10th grade. I had this idea in my head that I'd remain a friendless loser until graduation, at which point I'd be so socially stunted that I'd be alone for life. Highly irrational, I know, and on the surface it seemed that it was proven wrong within a relatively short space of time, because around the start of my third week, a group of kids invited me to sit with them during lunch. I was a ball of anxiety, but they were nice and told me that I was welcome to sit with them during lunch in the future. That meant a whole lot to me, as I always felt ultra-scrutinized every time I was walking among the tables, trying to find a place to sit. I sat with them for the rest of that third week, keeping quiet and trying to just blend in. They'd ask me a question every so often, where I was from, what kind of stuff I was into, and each time I'd try and give the least offensive answer possible. Again, just trying my best to fit in. But then, come Friday, they asked me if I wanted to hang out that night after school. I had to really stifle my enthusiasm because it meant the world to me that they thought that I was cool enough to hang. Then, when I asked where they usually chilled, they told me, the bridge. The bridge turned out to be an old, disused railroad bridge that ran over a river about a mile out of town. Every weekend, my new group of friends would head out there with whatever tobacco or alcohol they could get a hold of, because there, they were free to do whatever they wanted. Remember I told you about growing up in a kind of bad neighborhood? Well, I was already into all kinds of foolishness before we moved out of town. It wasn't anything too bad, but I'd already tried cigarettes and stuff, so it wasn't like I was thinking, oh no, these are bad kids, better stick to after-school Bible study club or whatever. I was down to hang with them, and I was psyched that they even asked me in the first place. So, at the end of school, my new friends come to make sure that I'm headed down to the bridge later that night. I'm like, sure, I'll be there, then try to hide the spring in my step as I'm walking off. I was legitimately euphoric. I'd found a new group of friends, and they seemed like my exact kind of people, too. Which is why I was so mad when some kid came to sit down next to me on the bus and told me not to go hang out with them. I'm probably going to sound like a total jerk here, and I'm embarrassed to even say this, but I thought the kid who approached me was a total loser. His clothes were dirty, he kind of smelled a little, and had this wild red hair that he obviously didn't wash. And when he told me not to hang out with those guys, I figured that he was trying to, I don't know, sabotage me or something. I know that makes me sound like a jerk and a bit of a cynic, but I was so insecure in my status as the new kid that I couldn't conceive of anyone going out of their way to be nice to me. I kind of just told him to get lost, then turned to face the window and ignored him, but he persisted. He said something like, I know it sounds crazy, but I think those guys are going to try to hurt you. I overheard them talking about shoving someone, and if the fall would kill them. I think they were talking about you. Again, I just told the kid to get lost in so many words, only much more forcibly this time, and he did eventually leave me alone. But after I got off the bus and walked back to my house, what he said kept looping in my mind. My new friends had invited me to the bridge, and they themselves had said how it was a railroad bridge over a river. Had they invited me there because they actually wanted to be my friends, or was it a trick, and they were planning on shoving me off the bridge as a prank? I think if the kid had said, they're going to beat you up or something kind of vague like that, I wouldn't have given it a second thought. But he specifically said shoving and falling. I remember thinking how the kid that warned me might have known all about their hangout, enough to give me a very specific kind of fake warning, if that makes sense. After all, I knew next to nothing about all the social dynamics in town, which in practical terms meant that I had no idea who to believe or who to trust. I spent like an hour thinking it over, then when the time came to go meet my new buddies over at the bridge, I was a total coward and decided not to go. I say coward because that's what it felt like at the time. I was too scared to go meet them, just in case the whole thing was some ruse to prank me, but I was also scared that I was about to blow my one shot at fitting in with a friend group at school. I wrestled with the two concepts back and forth for another 2 hours. Then, when I realized it was probably too late to go hang out, I just sort of sunk into a mild depression. On the surface, the reaction was as bad as I feared. My new friends said I couldn't sit with them anymore, that I'd been rude as hell to refuse their invitation. They said they'd waited around almost all night waiting for me to show, and that I hadn't shown them the courtesy of showing up for 5 minutes. And at the time, I was horrified. I'd reassured myself that maybe they wouldn't react so poorly. Then there they were, kicking me out of that friend group before I even had a chance to really prove myself. I was devastated, and went and sat on my own, and to add insult to injury, the stinky redhead kid came and sat with me, almost like he felt sorry for me. Now I know what you're thinking. Stinky redhead kid is a cool guy, and these days I would totally agree with you. But at the time, stupid 15-year-old me had nothing but contempt for him. If the moral of this story is that kids can be cruel, and then sadly, I guess that example extends to me too. Because once again, I told the kid to buzz off, leave me alone, and not even think about sitting with me ever again. I condemned myself to be lonely again for about a week until, by total happenstance, another new kid joins 10th grade. I figured this was my shot to make a friend. He was a dude and looked like they might be into similar stuff as me, so hopes were high. Next chance I got, I sat with him during lunch period and got talking to him a little. But then the next lunch period, guess who called him over to their table? You guessed it, the old friend group that I was very briefly a member of. I thought they did it on purpose, and I guess on one level they kind of did. It seemed like they'd kicked me out of one friend group and now they were denying me the chance to form another. Like a nightmare scenario where the guys I thought were going to be my friends kind of turned out to be my bullies. They had me sinking further into that very teenage-flavored depression, seeing this new kid doing all the stuff that I should have been doing with the people I should have been doing it with. And every Friday night for weeks on end, I'd be lying in my bedroom, totally depressed and wondering what those guys were doing out at the bridge. They obviously hadn't been planning to pull a prank on me because the new kid had been hanging with them for weeks, probably down at the bridge too, and if they had pranked him, especially by shoving him off the bridge, he sure was handling that well. Again, this had me totally depressed, and above all, I am out of my mind furious with that stinky redhead kid. I thought he totally tricked me into not hanging out with my future friend group, and probably so he could just have me all to himself, which to be fair is exactly what I tried to do with the new kid who joined 10th grade after I did. I remember one Friday night just stewing in my hatred for that stinky kid, fantasizing about giving him the old right there Fred in the cafeteria. But then the next day, when I was throwing a ball around with my dad, he said that if they kicked me out without a second thought, those kids weren't friends in the first place. And that, in the end, I'd be happy that I didn't go down to the bridge that Friday night because I wouldn't be stuck hanging out with a bunch of losers who are so fickle. At the time, it was sort of reassuring, but neither of us had any idea just how right he really was. The next morning, so Sunday, I'd been awake for maybe 2 or 3 hours before I realized that there was a kind of strangeness in the air. I hadn't been in town long, but weekends there were like weekends anywhere. Lots of people got the day off. Kids aren't at school, so I was used to seeing people walking down the street either by themselves or with their dogs. There was also this group of 3 kids who used to routinely ride their bikes up and down the street. I saw them after school sometimes and always saw them on weekends. But that whole Sunday morning for at least 2 to 3 hours, I didn't see a single person walking down the street, and nothing but a single car, which was my mom returning home from the grocery store before it closed early. I remember how when I got home, I went downstairs to see if she brought back any snacks or anything, and I could immediately tell something was wrong. She called my dad down into the kitchen, and when he got there, Mom told me to go up to my room. I asked why, and she snapped at me, telling me to do as I was told. Dad shut the kitchen door behind me, and I walked all the way to the stairs, but stopped on the first few steps so I could listen in on what they were saying. I couldn't make out every word they said, but I got enough to know that a dead body had been found in the woods outside of town, and that the rumor going round was that it was a kid from my high school. I was shocked, horrified even, but I also had no way of knowing which kid had been found dead. Like I said, I had literally zero friends to call about it, and this is before social media, so it's not like I could just search up some hashtag or scroll through a bunch of feed to read what people were saying about it. I had to wait until school the next morning to get any real info, and then just after 8 a.m., we got an announcement from the principal saying that we were all to file into the gymnasium for a special assembly. So that's what he did. Me and all the other kids walked off to the school's gym. Except it wasn't all the kids, and I think I might have been one of the first people to get an inkling of what had happened that Saturday night. As all the kids were filing into the gym, piling onto the bleachers or taking seats on the floor in front of it, I noticed that one particular group was nowhere to be seen. I've been in the habit of keeping an eye out on my old friend group, mainly out of bitterness, to be perfectly honest. I wanted to know where they were as much as possible so I could just avoid them. So as everyone's walking through the gym doors, I'm looking out for the group, but more and more kids are filling up the gym and there's no sign of my old friend group anywhere. Eventually, and once they're sure no one else is due to show up, one of the teachers closes the gymnasium doors, but still my old friend group are a no-show. And then it hits me. Either one of them ended up being the body they pulled out of the woods, or they'd done something truly terrible. Once the doors were closed, the principal started telling us about how something terrible had happened over the weekend, and the terrible thing was that a 10th grader had been found dead in the woods just outside of town. Obviously, quite a few of us had heard rumors by that point, but having it confirmed by an official was still very shocking, and I remember the gasps and oh my gods after the announcement was made. We were told that if any of us had any information, we were to approach the school resource officer. It didn't matter if classes were in session. If he had any info, you had to report it immediately. We weren't told who exactly had died either. We were quick to figure out who was missing from the gym, since a group of 5 kids were absent from school that day, but we didn't know which of them had been the one to lose their life. It took a while for the truth to come out, but I always had a gut feeling that something very specific had happened, and when the truth did finally come out, it turned out I was exactly right. The dead body found in the woods had belonged to the new kid, the one who joined 10th grade shortly after I did. He'd been found in a shallow stretch of river just below the old railroad bridge, the same place my former friend group used to hang out on a Friday night. According to forensics, it appeared as if the kid had jumped off the bridge, thinking the river was much deeper than it was, but in reality, it was only shin deep in the section he landed. He broke both of his legs, injured one of his arms in the fall, then after failing to drag himself out of the water with his one good arm, he drowned after becoming exhausted. There was a brief period where everyone in town thought that it was some kind of accident. You know, the kids were drinking, maybe doing drugs. Then all of a sudden, one of them believed that he could fly and tried jumping off the bridge. A lot of the more hysterical folks in town were blaming the kid's death on drugs, like that old LSD story where the college kid tries jumping off his dorm's roof because he was high on acid and thought that he was Superman. The same thing happened in our town, but only for maybe a few days at most, because once we all found out what actually happened, the reaction was very different. At first, All we knew was that the kid had fallen off the bridge somehow. The drug theory was prominent, and a lot of people figured that some kind of accident had occurred, but a handful of other folks suggested that the new kid had been pushed. I feel like that was one of the more extreme or less popular theories because people were asking themselves, why would they just murder the new kid like that? My potential new friends might have been a bunch of burnouts, but they weren't evil, were they? And to this day, I still don't quite know if it was an act of pure evil, but the cops sure decided that the law had been broken, and when the news broke that the kids had been arrested, it sent shockwaves through the local community. And when they were initially being questioned by the cops, it only took a little pressure for one of them to start singing like a canary. The whole thing was supposed to have been nothing but a prank. Push the new kid off the bridge. The worst they thought would happen was that he'd get wet before having to walk home in wet clothes while they laughed from up above. But that's not what happened, and they didn't realize what was actually happening until it was far too late. Apparently, the kids on the bridge ran down, dragged him out of the water, and tried to save his life, but it was no good. They couldn't revive him, and when they realized he was dead, they just ran off and left him there. The following night, someone was walking their dog down by the river, and it was them that found the body. One kid ended up going to juvie for second-degree murder, and I think one other kid went down for assisting him, but the other 3 kids got away with it completely. I guess the cops could only charge the pusher and the one who'd lied to help cover it up, but the other 3 kids got to go back to school like nothing had happened at all. They were complete pariahs for the remainder of high school. They never got that stink off themselves, but there was also someone I owed an apology to, and that was Stinky Redhead Kid. Carl and I were friends for almost 20 years afterwards, right up until the day we lost him in a freak car accident. And I think about him every single day. Not just because he was a close friend that I lost so suddenly, but because if it wasn't for him, I might not be around to enjoy a single day without him. So here's to you, Carl, and here's to all true friends, because Lord knows they're hard to come by. My wife and I met when we were still at NYU, and after we had our first child, we held out for 9 years in Tribeca before we moved upstate. I still miss living in Tribeca for a whole bunch of reasons, but it was not a place you wanted to raise a child. So after checking out a bunch of properties around Rochester and Buffalo, we ended up moving to a small, quiet town in western New York. 2 years into living in our new home, my son was almost 12, and my wife and I had just welcomed our daughter into the world. My son had made his first real friend during the first year of middle school, and as the weather got better and better as the summer approached, he and his new buddy would play outside more and more. His new friend lived just down the street from us, and boy, was he a character. He had a very active imagination and would invent all kinds of scenarios and games for them to play. For example, one time he called our house and had me pass along a message to my kid. That message being, aliens had invaded his backyard and he needed my son to come over and help fight them off. My kid knew that he wasn't serious, of course, but he still played along as he begged my permission to head over to his buddy's house so they could save the world. I kind of played along too, told him to destroy the mothership by 7 p.m. at the latest, then off he went to massacre extraterrestrials. So this carries on all summer, with my son getting calls about pirate ships, vampires, or mutant squirrels. And then one day, he gets a call from his buddy down the street, and they arrange to meet up later that day. I asked my son what the scenario was this time, and he told me something like, "There's a man down by the pond who's going to give us gold coins if we go on a quest with him." And I was like, okay, well, have fun, and carried on with whatever I was doing. And then, dad brain kicked in. My son had battled interdimensional invaders, he'd slain 3-headed dragons, and he'd blasted off to Mars with his buddy in the passenger seat of their rocket. But never in all the time they'd been playing together had they ever dealt with a man, let alone one that was offering a reward for something suspiciously vague like a quest. I walked up to my son's room and asked him if the man his friend referred to was actually real. And he gave me a look like I was crazy and told me, no, of course he's not real. And at first I took his word for it. Well, as time ticked by, the old dad brain persisted, so I walked back up to my son's room and asked if he was sure that the man was just made up. He thought about it and told me, I guess so. But I could clearly see that he wasn't 100% sure. So instead of just letting him head down to the pond, I decided to call his buddy's parents to see if they knew anything about this man. I gave them a call, and I was originally hoping to talk to my son's friend, but his parents told me that he'd already left the house on his bike about 20 minutes prior. They then told me that he was headed down to the pond, but were confused as to why he hadn't gone to fetch my son before he did. I could tell that they were starting to worry because if their kid told them that he was headed over to our place and then he went someplace else, that was an obvious cause for concern. But then as much as I shared their concern, I didn't want to go freaking them out by me mentioning a man who still could have been just some figment of their son's imagination. I just didn't want to make a whole situation out of something that could have been nothing, but still, I told them that I'd head down to the pond with my son right away, just to make sure everything was fine. They thanked me, we hung up, then I told my kid to put his shoes on because we were headed down to that pond together. And so off we went, and the pond was only 5 or 10 minutes walk from our house, so it didn't take long to get there. But when we did, we couldn't see my kid's buddy anywhere. I figured maybe he rode his bike off someplace else and would be arriving soon because my son and I arrived a little earlier than they'd arranged to meet. My kid was still kind of confused as to why I'd escorted him in the first place, but I told him I just wanted to check the place out a little bit and would wait until his buddy arrived to make sure he wasn't lost or something. And that's what I told him, and what I was really doing was scoping the place out to make sure that there wasn't some kind of diddler hiding in the bushes waiting for the boys. I walked around a little, just talking with my kid and trying not to make him feel over-supervised, even though that's exactly what I felt like I was doing. I've got my head on a swivel, keeping my eye out for any kind of person lurking nearby, but I don't see anyone, so I start to feel a little less paranoid. But then we waited, and we waited, but there was no sign of my kid's buddy, and when I asked if he was normally late, my son said no, and that he was normally early if he didn't stop at our house first. And upon hearing that, the feeling of paranoia started returning, so I asked my kid to take a little walk with me, and that way, maybe we could spot his buddy riding towards us on a bike. My kid is getting really confused at how I was acting, but he doesn't ask questions. He just follows me as I go walking off around the pond. The idea was to get a better look at the area that I had already and make sure that there was no one lurking further away who might swoop in the second I leave. The pond was in this piece of semi-wild parkland, a jungle gym here, some benches there, but mostly lots of wildflowers and bushes and stuff. And I was looking around and over the bushes. My son didn't know what to look for, so his eyes were wandering all over the place, and that's when he spots something familiar that looked like it had been shoved under a bush. It was his buddy's bike, but his buddy was nowhere to be seen. I didn't see what he was looking at, not at first anyway, but then he crouched down and dragged the bike out from the bush with yet another look of confusion on his face. He still had no idea why his buddy might have shoved his bike into a bush like that, or rather, he couldn't quite conceive of why someone else might want to do that. I started calling out his friend's name, and at this point he starts asking, "Dad, what's going on?" I was honest with him. I told him I was worried about his friend, and asked him to join me in calling out his name in hopes that he'd just hidden his bike, then gone off wandering someplace else. So we're walking along calling out this kid's name when all of a sudden, it was my turn to spot something. It was a shoe, barely visible among some reeds at the side of the pond, and it looked like it had been placed there just recently. My first thought was to tell my son to run to his buddy's house and tell their parents to call the police, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. I just couldn't. It was like an admission that something was horribly wrong. That, and I didn't want to leave him alone for even a minute out there, considering the frame of mind that I was in. But then, having him run with me all the way to his friend's house, that clued him in anyway, and by the time we got there, he was almost in tears. We had his buddy's mom walk him back to his house, then me and his dad called the cops before heading back down to the pond to look for his kid. And it was a true nightmare. Literally every parent's worst nightmare come to life, and I got a front row seat to watch a man lose his mind. The cops showed up and took over the search, then eventually opened up an investigation into the kid's disappearance. But to this day, he's never been found. The disappearance broke the kid's parents to the point that they just moved, and it haunted my son so bad that we ended up moving someplace else too. It's a terrible thing to say out loud, but he was never the same for a while after that, like he was afraid of his own shadow. But if that were me, and I had my childhood best friend snatched away like that, I would be the exact same way. In the summer of 2017, I moved from my small hometown of Barnsley in South Yorkshire to the much larger city of Manchester. I found a flat in a place called Mosside, which people said could be quite a rough area, but where I lived was no bother at all. People were nice, the neighbors were friendly, everyone just kept to themselves really, but the reputation of the place still kept me on my toes for the first few weeks of living there. I was careful where I went after dark. I always made sure my doors and windows were locked every time I went out, and I even did stuff like hide my laptop under my bed in its sleeve, just in case my flat did get broken into. It took just 3 weeks for me to have my first run-in with trouble, but when it came from a direction I'd never have expected, and nothing has ever topped it since in terms of sheer terror. So the place I lived in at the time was a 2-story building, one flat on the top and one flat on the bottom, with a little walk up on either side and shared a back garden out the back. Both the flats' wheelie bins were kept out the back, so every time the bin in my kitchen was full, I'd carry it into the backyard and pop it into one of the bins. I'd done this about 10 to 15 times in the 3 weeks that I'd been there, and it had already become a regular and uneventful routine. Then one night, at about 9 o'clock, I was taking the bin out after I had done all the washing up. I popped the bag in the bin, just like I'd done a dozen times before, when I heard a voice behind me say, "Don't move." The voice was coming from the other side of the fence at the end of the yard, and it was so calm that at first I thought it was just someone taking the mick. I turned around and was halfway through saying, "Who the bloody hell are you talking to?" when I saw him. There was a man, probably around my dad's age, so 50-something, leaning over the top of the fence at the end of the yard, and he was pointing a gun at me. Not like a handgun either. It was a full-on rifle, like a modern-looking one too. The second I saw him, I threw my hands up in the air and felt like sudden trembles coming over me from the adrenaline dump. I remember saying, "Please don't shoot me," to which the bloke responded, "Well, don't move then." A split second later, I noticed that he was wearing a baseball cap with the word "police" written on it, which was actually really reassuring for a moment. At least until it hit me that just about anyone could get a hold of a cap like that at your average fancy dress shop. I blurted out, "Are you the police?" And all the bloke said in response was, "Lift your shirt up." He wasn't barking orders like you'd expect the police to do. He just said it dead calmly with his gun still pointed at me. I think if he'd have asked me to do anything else, like get on the floor or put my hands behind my head, I'd have done just that, no questions asked, because that's something I've seen the police do before. But when he asked me to lift my shirt up, I was so confused that I couldn't help but ask why. The bloke instantly went, "Do as I tell you." But again, he didn't raise his voice or anything. He said it calmly and quietly. I didn't need telling twice. After all, he was the one with the gun, and I was bricking it so badly that I just did as he told me and lifted up my shirt without any clue as to why he was asking me. I lifted my shirt up and then put it down again, only for the bloke to be like, "Hang on a minute, lift your shirt up again, and turn around in a circle." I was beyond asking why by then, so I just did as he told me, and then lowered my shirt again after asking what this was all about. He didn't answer my question that time either. He just asked me what my name was, so I told him, and said Tom. He then goes, "Listen to me very carefully, Tom. I want you to walk towards me nice and slowly, arms raised, okay?" I'm still cacking myself, but I was getting more and more sure that he wasn't about to shoot me too, so I did what he said. When I got close to the back fence, the bloke goes to me, "Stop." So I do. But then he says, "Nice and slowly, take the latch off that back gate there for me. There's a good lad." Again, I did as he said, and pulled back the latch from the gate. The second I pulled it back, the bloke tells me, "Step back from the door, Tom." Then about 5 or 6 armed policemen, all wearing helmets and body armor and all that stuff, came rushing through, but still staying as quiet as they could. One of them was carrying one of those big door-smashing things. Then, when they got to the steps leading upstairs, he went first, and then his mates crept up after him. It was like something out of a film. It really was. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. We don't really see big guns like that in the UK, and we don't really see small ones either, so to see that proper commando-looking blokes burst into my back garden, I was just gobsmacked. We all just stood there, them waiting on the stairs which led to the flat above mine, me with my hands in the air until the bloke I'd been talking to said, "Right, Tom, come out the back gate there for me, quick as you can." I think I knew that because the guy had asked me to leave the back garden. It was all about to kick off, and just as I rushed out the gate and into the street, it did. I saw a group of police in front of me, and one of them starts saying, "Run to me, please, quick as you can," and then behind me, I heard the sound of the police smashing the door in and screaming, armed police. I could hear all this screaming from behind me, and people were coming out into the street to see what was going on as one of the police in front of me said, "You need to come with us." I asked them if I was being arrested, and they said no, which was a relief. But then this one policewoman says that I'm being detained for questioning under the Terrorism Act of 2006. I don't know why they've got to tell you the date of something like that, but I swear to God, right? That phrase, the Terrorism Act of 2006, is just burned into my memory now. I was like, what are you on about? I'm not a terrorist. But the policewoman told me not to worry. That's just what we've got to say. They were going to ask me a few questions, and if I hadn't done anything wrong, then I didn't have anything to worry about. I think once I heard that it was that level of serious, I realized any pushback was just pointless. If I'd have refused to go with them, like I might have done if it was just a drug raid or something, then they'd have just arrested me on the spot. So off I went to the police station to answer all their questions. Because I wasn't being interviewed under caution and wasn't formally considered a terrorism suspect, the interview happened without a lawyer present for me. They didn't take me to a proper interview room either. They took me into like a family room with all the couches and stuff that's supposed to make you feel a lot more comfortable. It didn't really help. Like I was still buzzing with adrenaline, then as they asked me all their questions, I answered them as best I could. But then some of the questions were very weird. They asked me what my neighbors upstairs were like and if they ever spoke to me, if they were friendly, stuff like that. Obviously, I'd only been there 3 weeks, so I didn't have much to tell them. I hadn't seen much of my neighbors, and when I had, they'd seemed normal enough. But then they started asking me things like if I ever smelled any strong chemicals coming from their flat, or if they used the front or back doors to get into their flat. Now, I'm no expert on these kinds of things, so I had no idea why they were asking me stuff like that, but I still answered their questions as best I could, and when they were finished, I was free to go. They weren't searching my flat or anything, just the one above, so I could go straight home and carry on with my evening. But that, as you can probably guess, was much easier said than done. The raid was all over the news, so for the next few hours, I sat watching the TV and scrolling through my phone. And that's when it actually got very real for me. The previous few hours had been a bit of a blur, but seeing it all unfolding on camera phones and seeing the BBC reporter standing right at the end of my street, it brought it home for me big time. I had actually been caught up in a bloody terrorism raid, and from what I learned later on, I was in a lot more danger than I'd first thought. Once I realized the bloke was actually a policeman, the one who was pointing his gun at me, I actually felt a bit relieved, like I said. I know he was pointing a gun at me, but I'm pretty sure that he wouldn't just bloody shoot me. It just gave me a good scare is all. But what I found out later is that the whole thing was considered a quote-unquote delicate operation, and that's because they were scared that whoever was inside the flat upstairs was going to just blow the place up if they got advance warning. And that's why the policeman didn't just start screaming at me when he saw me, and why they very subtly evacuated the neighbors on both sides of us. They were about to do the same thing with me when I took the bin out, and that's where it all started for me, getting a gun pointed at me instead of a friendly knock on the door. I found out later on that it was all connected to the Manchester Arena attack, which had happened just a few weeks before. One of the people suspected of helping the bomber was apparently living in the flat above me. Couldn't tell you if anyone was arrested or if anything happened to them after, but bloody hell. It was scary thinking I'd potentially been living so close to someone who'd been involved in something so horrible. Sometime in 2004, the residents of Bell Close in Ipswich woke up to find a moving van parked on their street. The for sale sign outside a vacant home had recently been taken down, and overseeing the unloading of boxes and furniture were a young and very happy-looking couple. They had moved to Ipswich from the much smaller coastal town of Felixstowe, and to their neighbors they embodied happiness, harmony, and hope for the future. Yet unbeknownst to all but one, the couple's arrival foreshadowed a great and terrible darkness. On the evening of December 2nd, 2006, just over 2 years after our young couple moved into Bell Close, a member of the local constabulary was patrolling the banks of a nearby river when he made a horrifying discovery. The naked body of a young woman was floating in the waters of Belstead Brook, and within the hour, the scene was awash with uniformed police officers, plainclothes detectives, and white-gowned forensics teams. The woman turned out to be 25-year-old Gemma Rose Adams, last seen around 3 weeks earlier near Ipswich's West End Road. Police discovered Gemma had been addicted to heroin as a teenager and had been working as a prostitute at the time of her murder. Just 6 days later, on December 8th, the body of 19-year-old Tanya Nickel was discovered floating in a nearby body of water. Nickel had successfully graduated from secondary school, but by age 17 was living in emergency accommodation while prostituting herself to support a burgeoning drug addiction. Police interviewed those who knew her and discovered that she was a close friend of the first victim, Gemma Adams. Detectives had yet to properly begin their investigation into Tanya's death when a third body was found in an area of woodland near Nacton. 24-year-old Annalie Alderton had been 3 months pregnant when she was asphyxiated before her body was arranged in a cruciform position. She was last seen on the 1843 train to Ipswich, but after disembarking at the station, she disappeared. Police discovered Annalie had attended Coppleston High School, where her academic performance had been exemplary. Yet following her father's death from lung cancer in 1998, Annalie had become increasingly reliant on heroin to cope with the grief. In the aftermath of 3 dead bodies being discovered in quick succession, the Suffolk Constabulary held a press conference. Before a gathering of local journalists and following the results of a preliminary investigation, The chief constable warned all the women of Suffolk to remain from frequenting poorly lit areas of Ipswich after dark. The day after the press conference, the bodies of 2 more young women were found near Levington. According to police, 24-year-old Paula Clennell and 20-year-old Annette Nichols had been murdered via compression of the throat. Paula Clennell was last seen on the night of December 10th, and just days prior, had taken part in a man-on-the-street-style interview with a local news station on the subject of the recent murders. A self-confessed prostitute, Clennell told the reporter that she was, quote, a bit wary of getting into cars, but I need the money. Police discovered that she'd moved to Ipswich around 10 years earlier and had her 3 children removed from her care due to crippling addiction to heroin. Annette Nichols, the oldest of the 5 victims, had been drug addicted for around 6 years. A mother of 1, she'd been employed as a beautician prior to her addiction, but had since given up custody of her child so she could pursue organized prostitution. She was also the only other victim to be posed in a cruciform position, as in the image of Christ on the cross. Given the backgrounds of the victims, the locations they were dumped, and the ways in which Nichols and Alderton had been posed, the Suffolk Constabulary concluded that the murders were linked. They launched a large-scale investigation, codenamed Operation Sumac, with the chief constable declaring that public assistance would be key to its success. The killer, believed to be a heavy-set male in his 30s or 40s, almost certainly lived among them. He was someone's husband, someone's father, or someone's son. The police would do all they could to bring the man to justice, but they were not best placed to spot the signs. They warned the citizens of Ipswich to be wary of anyone who'd recently had their car thoroughly cleaned, or anyone who disappeared at night for long, unexplained stretches of time. The prospect left a dark cloud hanging over Ipswich, and its citizens wondering which of them would be next. On December 14th, police held another press conference where they announced that the investigation was making steady progress. They discovered that each woman had been murdered in a primary location before being transported to a body of water or an area of woodland close to a school or church. They also announced that they believed their suspect was a violent, possibly religious man who made frequent company with ladies of the night. They subsequently warned the public to be on the lookout for any male who had suddenly and inexplicably come in possession of women's clothing, as it was believed that the killer was in the habit of taking trophies from his hapless victims. The following day, police announced that the number of officers working the case full-time had risen to 600, and that support staff from over 25 different British police forces was lending material or human resources to the investigation. Just 5 days later, on December 19, 2006, the Suffolk Constabulary conducted an early morning raid on a quiet suburban street just south of the River Orwell. The name of the street was Bell Close, and the man arrested was a 48-year-old man named Steve Wright, the very same that had moved into the vacant house with his partner over 2 years prior. The move had been an optimistic one, with Steve and wife relishing the chance to start a new life together following the former's failed first marriage. Yet somehow it ended with the brutal murders of 5 young women, leaving both loved ones and law enforcement asking, why? Steve Wright was born in Norfolk back in April of 1958 and was the second child of an RAF policeman and a veterinary nurse. Due to his father's career, the family moved around a lot during Steve's childhood, and he spent his youth in Malta, Singapore, and Suffolk. Before Steve was even 10 years old, his parents underwent a brazenly bitter divorce. His father later said that Steve's mother abandoned them, leaving the young man searching for a mother figure he would never find. Steve's mother, on the other hand, claimed his father was a violent drunk and that she left out of fear for her life. She also claimed that fear for Steve's the only reason that she hadn't taken him with her, as his father had vowed to hunt them down and murder them if she attempted to take his son away. As a result of his turbulent upbringing, Steve grew into a painfully shy young man who struggled with both relationships and employment. He left school at 16 with no qualifications and, following a brief stint as a hotel waiter, joined the British Merchant Navy. He worked as a chef on ferries sailing out of Felixstowe, but after less than a year of service was granted a request for separation. Steve then hopped from job to job, plying his hand as a dock worker, a barman, a landlord, and a forklift driver. But it wasn't long before he gravitated back to sailing, and he applied for a job as a steward on the cruise ship Queen Elizabeth II. Steve spent 6 years aboard what he affectionately referred to as the QE2 and traveled all over the world in the process. At every port they stopped, Steve was given a few days shore leave, but unlike his shipmates who spent their time shopping or sightseeing, Steve was in the habit of visiting local brothels. It became something of an addiction for him, and his coworkers knew him to disappear for days at a time before returning to ship, seeming quiet and distant. At the end of his 6 years on the QE2, Steve moved to Norwich and became the landlord of a pub known as the Ferry Boat Inn. The inn was located in an extremely rough area of Norwich and was frequented by many of the city's ladies of the night. Steve was believed to have been a frequent customer of theirs, and this may or may not have contributed to his eventual dismissal, a mere 5 months after he was first hired. Steve then moved to London, where he was visited by his mother during the holidays of 1992. Patricia Wright later told journalists that, despite a warm initial reception, her son had, quote, changed completely. On Christmas Day, Steve drank continuously from morning until night. Then, when his mother suggested he slow down a little, he flew into a rage and threw her out of his home. It was F this and F that, she told reporters. He said such terrible things. He obviously didn't want anything to do with me. It was around this time that Steve began to visit London massage parlors, but this was an expensive habit, unsuited to the minimum wage jobs he tended to stick to. As a result, Steve began gambling to finance his nightly companionship, but it wasn't long before spiraling debts began to take their toll. Seeing no way out of his present situation, Steve attempted to gas himself in his car, and he was later found lying in an alley in Haverhill before being taken to hospital. Steve's stepbrother, Keith, learned his brother had accumulated £30,000 in debt, all in just a few short months, and added that the incident proved a watershed moment in Steve's life. Before that, he used to be quite outgoing, Keith said. He'd go out for a beer, have a laugh and a joke, but after he went a bit quiet, it was hard to get much out of him. Following his recovery, Steve went on a 10-week trip to Thailand, spending what little money he had left on pills and prostitutes. He even sold his car and furniture to fund the trip, and upon his return, Steve was forced to move in with his elderly father to avoid sleeping on the streets. Having hit rock bottom, Steve appears to have undergone a period of intense self-improvement whilst lodging with his father. He found a series of steady jobs which afforded him membership of a local golf club and was a regular dapper dresser at the affixed hotel's bar. Steve was doing so well that he managed to begin a relationship with a woman named Pamela, the same woman he would eventually move to Ipswich's Bell Close with in 2004. The meeting marked a period of relative stability in Steve's life, and prior to their relocation to Ipswich, he stopped visiting brothels altogether. Yet just 6 months after he moved into Bell Close, old habits returned with a vengeance. Steve started off by visiting massage parlors, but by October of 2006, discovered he could purchase company for as little as £20 from the street junkies who roamed near his home. One woman claimed Steve had visited her 3 days following the discovery of the final 2 victims. He was a regular. I felt safe with him, she said. But that night he turned nasty. He pinned me down, which is something he never used to do. He scared me because that wasn't like him. But when I heard he'd been changed, I thought, oh God, I've been in his house. He could have done anything with me. I never thought it would be him. Steve's trial began on January 16th of 2008 with his defense hinging on the idea that Although he was a regular visitor of Ipswich's so-called red light district, he was not the woman's killer. The prosecution raised the prospect of Steve having an accomplice, claiming there was, quote, no evidence that her body had been dragged by one person. Just over a month later, on February 21st, and after 8 hours of deliberation, the jury returned unanimous verdicts against Wright on all 5 counts of murder, prompting the prosecution to argue that Wright should receive a whole life tariff and thus never be released from prison. The judge granted their request, and the next day, Steve Wright was ordered to spend the rest of his natural life detained at Her Majesty's pleasure. Greg Bradshaw, Paula Clennell's brother-in-law, told the press, "These crimes deserve the ultimate punishment, and that can only mean one thing: the death penalty. Where a daughter and the other victims were given no human rights by this monster, he will be guarded by the establishment at great cost to the taxpayers of this country and emotionally to the bereaved families." However, the father of Gemma Adams was not so quick to call for violence when he said, "I am very relieved and pleased for all the families that this is now over. Finally, we can all start to get on with our lives in peace." Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 7 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit r/Let'sReadOfficial or over email, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, I just clogged all of your toilets.